Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast, a security awareness series. We're on episode 172. I'm Chris Hadnagy, founder and CEO of Social Engineer, as well as social-engineer.org and the Innocent Lives Foundation, and hosting this podcast since 2009. I think that's when we did podcasts on record players, I think. And I'm joined by Ryan, our COO here at Social Engineer. Nice to have you here, Ryan.
Thanks, Chris. As you said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Social Engineer LLC. I've been the open source intelligence trainer, primary trainer for SECom for a number of years, training at Black Hat and DEF CON or DerbyCon and other public-private classes. I've been in the information technology world for about 24 years, with the last 9 being focused on adversary simulation and security awareness. So it's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here with me, as always. And a couple little announcements before we get to our guest. If you're interested in the topic of social engineering, we have started a Slack channel. Well, it's been started for quite a while now. There's over 1,000 people in it every day talking about all sorts of topics: pretexting, phishing, the psychology behind human hacking, as well as a whole job board. We've had 7 or 8 people so far find employment by coming on the Slack channel. Companies are in there looking for employees. So if you're interested in the topic of social engineering and having a family-friendly conversation, then come on in to the Slack channel that's in the show notes, or you can hit it up on the Human Hacker Twitter, and you can see the link to get into that Slack channel there. Also, we want to thank Clutch, as always, for giving us the intro music. We love that band. Check them out, pro-rock.com, especially their new single, Red Alert. It's all about COVID-19 and how guitar pedals spread the magnet. No, I'm just kidding. It's a joke on it, but you should listen to the song. It's pretty awesome. And you can check them out, pro-rock.com. And please don't forget to visit innocentlivesfoundation.org. The work that we're doing there with my team is just astounding. We're now over 430 cases handed into law enforcement. Our mission is to help law enforcement agencies around the globe stop child predators and child traffickers. My team of devoted employees, as well as volunteers there, have been working tirelessly in this mission now for the last 5 years, and I'm excited to see the progress that we've made. So we're really, really happy to have your support. Check out what you can do there at innocentlivesfoundation.org. Okay, now let's get to the fun part. We're joined today by Ted Harrington. You may know that name because he's an author of a book called Hackable: How to Do Application Security Right. He's also the executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators, the company of ethical hackers famous for hacking cars, medical devices, and password managers, which I am sure we're going to be talking about that, because especially that last one, password managers, we get that question all the time here at SECom. Ted's been named both Executive of the Year by American Business Awards and SD Metro 40 Under 40 Entrepreneur. So Ted's been featured in more than 100 media outlets: Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Forbes, the list goes on. And we'll put some of those links to how you can contact Ted and follow some of the things he's doing in the show notes. But Ted, thank you for joining us here on the show today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be with you guys. Let's go.
So let's talk about this, okay? So first of all, I have to start off, before I get to the question I really want to ask, is how did you start off in this industry?
Well, I knew what I was looking for in terms of principles, right? I had some guiding principles in my life, things like, do hard things that matter in the service of others and get better every day. And before this, I was running a tech company in water, which had some of those things, but not necessarily all of them. And I wound up being introduced to the guy who would go on to become my now business partner. We were introduced, a friend in common from the PhD program at Hopkins. And I met this guy. We were not literally at a bar. We're just talking about what is it like, working in ethical hacking. And once I understood that those things that I really wanted were here, it was a no-brainer. And so he and I basically took the company that we're working on now, and he had started it a few years before, bought out his co-founders, and we were like, let's just reboot this thing. So we effectively took ISE, which you mentioned in the intro. That's how I got into it. It was like, all right, I'm going to enter this by starting a company or restarting a company, which is kind of a wacky way to get into it if you think about it. But that was my path.
It's a unique story for sure. Most of the time, people come in and they tell us that they started off in college with this and that, and they worked their way up. And you said, "I'm just going to start a company and do it." That's fascinating.
It was. I'm the kind of person who would do that too. Who's like I wanted to run a marathon. I'm like, well, I got to run the Boston Marathon, so we'll start with that. You know, it's like the
Really?
most prestigious marathon in the world. I'm like, we'll just go there first. So that's like gives you a sense of the way I see the world. But I also think when I look back on it, entering security in that way it's been really helpful for me, because unlike people who, there's so many people in security, you guys are probably amongst them, who are like, oh, I was like hacking a thing since I was, a kid or whatever. And that wasn't me. And so I really had to learn the principles of it. And I really had to, the proverbial, okay, explain it to me like I'm 5, and they do, and I'm like, now explain it to me like I'm 3. Like it's really, because I just didn't get it, and that was a good thing. I didn't have any of those like presumptions, and so I think that really helped me. That helped me certainly in writing a book, because even 10 years later, I still remember what it feels like to like not know what a basic principle feels like. And I want to be able to convey that to somebody else. You have to get rid of the jargon. You have to get rid of the sort of like insider speak. And so it was a good forcing function to learn by being like, all right, now I'm going to employ people to do this. Like, what?
That's kind of cool, though. I mean, that probably makes it easier for you to educate people who are new in the industry, because you came from that, where sometimes in our industry, we have that bad name of being like those guys on the IT crowd. Like you just treat everybody like they're dumb because they don't know things. And you coming from having to learn those basic principles probably makes you a really good teacher in those things, and probably why people really enjoy your book.
Yeah, I learned this thing when I was writing my book that I realized I'd sort of been doing all along, but maybe not well enough. And I think I'm very good at it now, which is like when you're conveying an idea, the whole way I wrote my book was as if I was speaking, like talking, not writing something, but actually having a conversation with my, at the time, 12-year-old nephew. And he doesn't know anything about security. He doesn't know anything about corporate America. And so if I'm trying to explain a principle to him, I have to like really make it straightforward and, get rid of all the junk. And if I can make him understand, he's, a digital native. So of course he understands some of the ideas. But being able to do that, that's something I recommend to anybody at any level of any profession. Just explain it like you're talking to a child. And a smart kid, he's a smart kid. He's not an idiot. And that even to people who really know what they're talking about, it makes it so much easier to have conversations. And I would definitely recommend that.
Some of my favorite authors do that. Like I love Paul Ekman, Dr. Paul Ekman. He talks about science and psychology, but he talks about it like he's explaining it to his 12-year-old nephew. So when I read it, I don't feel dumb. I actually go, oh, I get it now. Like this makes sense to me. Thank you for
Which is the point,
talking to
right?
me.
You want to understand.
Yeah, right. I want to understand it. So how did you go from this, like, okay, I'm not even in security. You start a company, but now you're going to focus on cars, medical devices, and password managers. Like, where did that come into the play?
Yeah, so I alluded to it briefly a moment ago, but this idea that my business partner, he had started the company a few years prior to that, so maybe like 5 or 6 years. We were going through the process of essentially restarting it, rebooting it, completely reimagining the company. But that was effectively what his academic pedigree was, basically. The origin story of the company was literally building a weaponized software radio that enabled the researchers, they weren't attackers, they were doing security researchers, to start a Ford Escape without the key. So they're able to actually, like with the computer, start the car. And that made, as you might imagine, it was pretty big news. And so as a result, companies came calling and saying, hey, you know how to break things, can you help us? And so that's the whole driving spirit of, certainly of our company, but all of ethical hacking. I would include social engineering in this too, right? Is like, we want to find how systems break to make them better. And fortunately we found a way that there's a business model around that. And, but it's like, my business partner, he says, he's like, man, I can't believe I get to do bad guy stuff, get paid for it, and not go to jail. This is great.
That is a fun part of the job. So is there a password manager that is really, really hard to hack? I won't ask if it's unhackable because I know that's a silly question, but is there a password manager that's really, really hard to hack? So it's like maybe the most secure or more secure?
It's funny, actually, I just did an interview with Washington Post a couple days ago on this exact question. So it might be something worth dropping in the show notes because it tells you also how to set them up. So for the average person who's like, what do I do with this? So the answer is that the question really comes down to implementation, because the design of these systems, that for the most part, from what white papers are revealed about how the systems work, the design's pretty good, right? Avoiding having passwords stored locally in plain text, using cloud services instead. And so the models are pretty good. The question really comes down to implementation. Is it actually built that way? Is it? And there's almost always a discrepancy between design and implementation in almost every system. And that's really where the weaknesses come. So I can't necessarily answer that question with certainty without getting, rolling up our sleeves and getting hands, under the hood or whatever other euphemism I'm going to use here to actually hack the things. But I can say that even with their flaws, and they are flawed, and we've published research showing how you can actually pop password managers. Even with their flaws, it's still better to use one than to not use one, because the benefits significantly outweigh the risk.
That's a great message, because even though I don't do what you do, I've always said that to people who ask me this question. It's like, look, I don't have enough knowledge to tell you if a password manager is hackable or not, but it's still better to use it, because what's your alternative? Using the same password, writing them down, putting them in a notepad? Right? Yeah. Reusing. I mean, it's just any of those other options are horrible compared to having a password manager. So I like that message. Thank you for that.
And there's a technique you can use that makes it so that if the password manager itself does get hacked, that your whole world doesn't come crumbling down. It's a little complicated. I've been meaning to write a blog that gives you sort of the step-by-step details on it. Maybe this will be the spark under my butt to do that.
Yes, I like
but the technique is essentially this. If you can imagine your password is a pen with a cap on the pen. So what goes into Bank of America or whatever bank you use, the password is actually the pen plus the cap. Okay. But what you store in the password manager is just the pen, and you remember the cap. So the cap can just be a couple digits or whatever, and it's what's called a modifier. So when the password manager auto-populates the pen, you just manually type in the cap, what's the equivalent to the cap. So now the password is actually used to log you in, but if the password manager gets popped, all that they get is the pen without the cap. So they don't actually get the password because the rest of it is in your head. And it can be as simple as 1 or 2 or 3 digits. It can be the same modifier for all passwords, because you get the unique element by what's the pen itself, right? By making those complex and long and unique. And it requires a little bit of habit change to do this, because the password managers are so easy, right? It's it auto-populates it, you click login. What I'm suggesting is you now have to, the way you set them up requires a little bit of change of behavior, the way you use them, slight change in behavior. But man, your life is so much easier, and you can sleep with confidence that whatever password manager you're using, you're good.
Yeah, and that's you created a method for, I don't know, psychological salt. You salted the password, but using your brain.
Exactly.
That's an awesome idea.
Yeah. And you only need to remember now 2 things. You need to remember your master password to log into the password manager, and the modifier. And as I said, the modifier can be the same for all of them as long as they're unique, what's in the manager. And isn't that way easier than using the same password and everything? And
I mean, that's way easier, because you can use any digits that are rememberable for you, and it would take someone forever to just even guess that that's what you did if your password manager got popped and they started using these passwords.
Yeah, that's a risk I think people will be willing to take, right?
Yes.
Password manager gets popped. The attacker looks and is getting stumped by yours and is now I'm going to figure out what their modifier, it's just not going to happen.
Right, yeah. What digits would this guy use as a modifier?
Right.
That's awesome. I'm actually writing that down. Yeah, that's a great tip. Yeah.
No, I'm just generally curious, the way you keep talking about how learning from the very beginning and how to communicate that in a meaningful way to people that you're helping. Have you run into a lot of, or any maybe opposition to the way that you're describing things, or how do you get around people that, not necessarily know-it-alls so much, but when you're trying to explain something and they kind of get what you're getting, how do you bridge that gap when you're trying to explain it? I'm thinking from an executive standpoint, you're bringing your advice to an executive and they hold themselves in high regard. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a whole field unto itself, right? How do you convince executives, especially ones who are I don't want to know, just give me the green light or the red light. They're like, I don't care about any of the details. And I get that.
Right.
That's their job. Their job is to take small bits of information, synthesize it, make decisions. That's why they employ you, right? To be the expert. So I think when it comes to communicating with executives, the first thing we have to do is we have to understand what they care about. So like we have to put ourselves in their shoes. They don't care what it means. Like, oh, you got root on something. They don't care. But what they do care about is what's the business impact? Like literally, why should I care? And that's incumbent upon us as security professionals to be able to articulate that. And I don't know if I actually think it's probably a weakness that exists probably across the entire security community. It's something I'm always trying to work to get better at, is how do we communicate that so that ultimately a business decision can be made? Because we do have to realize that our job in security, we should not halt business. We should enable it. And where security practitioners sometimes see it the opposite way, like, no, you can't do that. That's where now there's this conflict. But if an executive sees us as their allies, we're on the same team, and we speak in their language, that's how we wind up being able to overcome that barrier. But we have to understand how they think. We have to speak in terms they care about. We have to talk about business outcomes, and that's how we get it done.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, which we get this question a lot on this particular podcast, because people are always wondering, especially when it comes to security, sometimes the hardest part is to convince those higher ups of why this is important. And I think like you nailed it there by focusing on the impact, not all the fancy words, not all the cool things that we can do here to show you where you're vulnerable. It's how will doing this or how will not doing this affect your business? That's a really smart way of approaching that kind of a conversation.
One of the things that I guess learned, or learn's maybe not the right word, but that I observed when I was in the process of writing this book, I was thinking, I asked myself the question, well, why do people invest in security? It costs time, it costs money, it costs person power, it costs the prioritization of one priority ranking over another. And so why do people spend in this way? And as a security professional myself, I was like, oh, because it's the right thing to do. And you realize it doesn't matter that it's the right thing to do. There must be another thing. It must be and also. And so I started to think about, well, what is the and also? So, okay, it's the right thing to do. We can all agree with that. I don't think anyone listening to this needs to be convinced that security is worthy unto itself. Or I would hope people don't need to be convinced of that. But why would a business do it? And I've realized that the way that most people think about security is they think about it as a tax or a cost center. And what it does is it avoids bad things. So you look at it and you're like, okay, if we're going to spend some money that we really can't measure a success outcome on, and the point is to just avoid a bad thing, how do we minimize that spend? And I realized when I looked at the companies that I'm in the fortunate position to serve as our customers, almost every single one of them actually think about it differently. They see security as how do they get a good thing? So yes, how do we avoid a bad thing? We don't want to get hacked. Obviously, everybody wants that. But they also look at it and they say, well, can I use my security investment in order to establish trust with the companies I'm trying to sell to, with the stakeholders that, investors, whoever. And that to me I was both bummed because I'm like, oh man, that's a totally capitalist reason to invest in security. But you realize, well, that's how the world works. And almost all of them, like I said, there's some who aren't maybe commercialized businesses, so they think about it slightly differently. But this idea that security is a competitive advantage. So for organizations who can do two things, one, who can actually secure their systems. That's a big thing in itself. It's not like that's a big thing. So first you have to actually be able to secure the systems. But then if you can prove it, you can talk about it authentically, credibly, in a transparent way. Yeah. What does that do? That builds trust. And when you build trust, now that organization you're trying to do business with or whatever, they're much happier to move faster. Anyone who's tried to sell anything to an enterprise knows, anything within tech knows that you are going to get hounded on security. You're going to have to do questionnaires. You're going to maybe even go through an assessment. And the people who try to like do the hand wavy, obfuscate what's really going on, they're the ones who, that process takes a lot more time. But the ones who are like, look, here's what we did. Here's how we did it. Here's what we found. Here's how we're fixing it. Those are the people who actually expedite that whole process.
It's really an amazing thought. I don't think I've ever had someone here talk about the idea of security being motivated by its public appearance or how it looks in the public, but it makes a lot of sense. I mean, how many times, and maybe you can't say this, but how many times have you worked with a client and went, wow, I really like how secure they are. I'm going to move some of my business to that company.
After we've worked with them. Yeah. I
Yeah.
have that. Yeah. Maybe not at first, but.
Yeah. And that's happened to us here too, where we've moved certain parts of our business to another company because we're like, man, you guys actually handle it right. Mm-hmm. Now they take those kind of case studies or white papers or our reports and they kind of parade them around like, hey, look we got this great, we're doing this. Here's what we're doing. And other people then come to us and say, hey, we heard you're doing this for this company. Can you,
Yeah.
So I never thought of it in the way you put it, that it's, for them, it's kind of like a badge of honor. Like, hey, we're doing this right. So you can use our services with confidence kind of thing. That's a neat sales approach.
And they should. And as I was thinking about this idea, the book has 10 chapters. The whole 10th chapter is about this idea of like, how do you actually capitalize on that? And you described one, right? Which is take your report from your security partner and you use it in your sales process. And at first I felt a little icky about it. I'm like, am I really helping people like look past the security benefit and make it this other thing? And what I realized was I actually don't have a problem with that. The problem that I have is with the companies who have recognized this problem, right? That people want to do business, the companies they do business with, they want them to be secure, but they don't want to do the first part. They don't want to actually secure their systems. Happens all the time where people put, we've seen this claim everywhere, right? Where it's something like, fast, easy, secure. And then there's no discussion of security on their site anywhere. And that's kind of BS in my opinion, because you're like, well, the average person can't verify they can verify if it's fast, they can verify if it's easy, but they can't verify if it's secure. And at that point, you're just straight up lying. And I think that's an unfair thing. And so that's why I really advocate for not just talking about security as a marketing benefit, but talk about it credibly, authentically, like open kimono, show the reports, because it is really a reflection of your core values too. Like companies who say, we put the customer first, but then don't invest to protect the customer. Like there's a dissonance there.
Yeah. When you were saying that, I was thinking, I have a trainer and about a year and a half ago, I started on a health journey, right? Lost a bunch of weight, got in shape.
Right.
And my motivation for doing it, I wish I could say it was because I wanted to be around longer for my kids. I realized that I was going to be unhealthy, all of that wonderful, good dad stuff. But really I was sick of going out in the yard and trying to plant stuff and being out of breath. So that was my motivation, right? So I'm like, I'm tired, of not being able to just dig a hole and be out of breath here. So my motivation was not maybe the best, but the end result is the same, right? So I look at like what you said, like, okay, that chapter, maybe you feel icky when you write it, and maybe that will help some people be secure or take security in that next step. But if the end result is that their clients are safer, their customers are safer, their employees are safer, our data is safer, I don't care why they did it, right? If I'm using that company, I don't care what their motivators were, as long as they did it right, because I don't want my stuff getting hacked, right? So if you talk them into it because, they want to put a gold star on their website, great, do it.
Yep.
Like, because I'll take it,
I definitely don't have a problem with that being the motivation. I think that's actually a good motivation for me to. It's the problem I have more was I'm like, man, am I going to give the whole playbook for how to use security in your marketing that someone could potentially be like, I'll just skip the security part and I'll just like roll this playbook out. The playbook wouldn't work if you didn't do the security part. Be pretty obvious, but it's even like in the book, my publisher doing the interior layout, they're like, just want to make sure you want to do it this way. It was as you finish chapter 9, it's like, blank page. And there was this big, it's like a big like the warning triangle. And it's like, warning, The next chapter only applies if you did the previous 9 chapters. If you did not do the previous 9 chapters, this is not for you.
And everyone's going to go read that regardless, because that warning makes you want to go read it. Right?
100%.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be hard to be very transparent if you don't follow those 4 steps, right? Because it's going to be being transparent naturally. They're going to say we have these deficiencies, and if we're not fixing them, then that's pretty obvious if they're following those rules. So I think it should be pretty safe that putting out bad marketing might not be a safe thing to do.
I'd agree. We had this kind of funny thing happen. I still can't believe this happened, but it did. This is a true story. We published this. We did a whole bunch of research around routers. And we were going through responsible disclosure, which for anyone listening, if you know what that is, the process is where a security researcher finds an issue and then submits it to the afflicted manufacturer and says, hey, you've got 60 or 90 days or whatever to fix this, and we're going to publish it. We want you to fix it before it's published. But it also puts them on notice in case they try to just ignore it, that if you don't reply, we're going to do it. Maybe we'll redact the attack details or whatever. So going through responsible disclosure as a researcher is actually very frustrating. Many companies don't have a way to submit these types of findings. They sometimes are non-responsive. And when we were publishing this research, we'd been going through responsible disclosure for, I think, 90 days on that one. And one company in particular, I think there were like 7 vendors or something who were involved, who they weren't involved. They were subjects. We bought the materials on our own, and we weren't working with them. We just did it as research. And one of them didn't respond to anything, just like non-responsive. And then finally came time to publish. So we published. And that very day, they finally call us back. And they're like, hey, we saw the article in, I think it was in CNET or something. They're like, oh, we saw the article, and we'd really like to change things. And we're psyched because we're like, that's the point of security research, is to make things better. And so we're like, great, let's talk. And they said, oh, we have an executive in your area. He'll come to your office tomorrow morning. We're like, wow, these guys they're moving on this. This is great. Like, it's too bad that they had to be, in the news first, but whatever it takes, like what you were saying before, Chris, like let's get them there.
Yeah.
And so the next morning, this dude shows up, and it was within like 39 seconds, we understood why he was actually there. He didn't want to change the tech. He wanted to change the story. And so when it became pretty clear we weren't going to just like change it because they asked us, they then sent us, I need to frame this. I need to frame it and put it on my wall. They sent us a memo. It's an internal memo. And it says, we self-certify that there are no vulnerabilities in this product. And they literally had, like, someone went and bought a rubber stamp that said, certified. And they like stamped it. They sent us this rubber stamped memo that says we and we were like, guys, it doesn't work this way. Like,
yeah, that's security though, isn't it? Right? I mean, I could do that, right? We're secure, right, Ryan?
Yeah.
I have a stamp.
Sure.
Yeah. Have a stamp.
We have lots of stamps. It'll say anything.
We have lots of stamps. Wow. Yeah,
but that's what you were saying,
framed.
Ryan. Right? Yeah, it's like they tried to get the marketing benefit without the actual security work. And it's funny that we can tell this ridiculous, very true story, but people do think that way, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. We've had similar situations with responsible disclosure, where you hear the things like it's a feature, not a bug, and we're just going to ignore you and hopefully it will go away. And sadly, though, I think I would say not sadly, happily, a lot of companies, though, I see nowadays are willing to work a little more closely to try to make these things better. I remember some of the olden days going back like 15 years ago. It was like pulling teeth to get any kind of disclosure going on. Nowadays with bug bounty programs and stuff, it seems like they're a little more open to it. You can hope. But yeah, still very frustrating when you don't get that right response. I can only imagine.
It's come a long way, but we still got a ways to go for sure.
Especially in the medical device field, since that's one of the areas that you focus on. That seems like you would get a lot of quick reaction from that industry. Is that something that you see often when you find flaws in medical devices?
The medical device challenge is profound because you have additional constraints on top of the traditional constraints of building a system. So you're building a software system, also has a hardware component to it, and that alone is complex. Then you've got this huge issue with regulation, where the government actually dictates what's allowable or not allowable for use on patients in the context of security. And then, as if that wasn't enough, that is like wrapped in a tortilla of who's responsible for it in the medical environment. And the hospital, they're responsible for some aspects of it. The medical device manufacturer, they're responsible for some aspects of it. There's usually a third party that like kind of manages the whole thing. And it's just not simple to, especially when you're getting into like the very expensive ones, it's just not simple to make changes. And so that's a really, really big problem, and I have a lot of empathy for the people who are dealing with that challenge. And I'm very happy to see this whole corner of the security community that's like diehard about this, because I believe, I didn't even mean to use the word diehard ironically, but everyone in healthcare talks about security as a privacy issue, as like, how do I make sure that my patient record isn't stolen or whatever? And that's true, it is that. But I see it actually as a patient safety issue. And like we published research that showed there was so many different ways you could hurt patients. But for example, one was we found you could go to the lobby of a hospital. You could go to one of those kiosks where you check in for your appointment. Those run in what's called kiosk mode, which is like limited functionality. Just basically input your information that you're there. But we found how you could take it out of kiosk mode. And once you take it out of kiosk mode, there was a way where you could actually pivot to access other systems on the same network. And the way it's supposed to work in a hospital is that's something publicly facing, like the medical devices, they should be on their separate network. But in this case, it wasn't. That's a very common thing where, hey, it's more expensive and difficult to do a thing a certain way. Even though it's better security, we're just not going to do that. That was what happened here. And so we found that from the lobby, not a credentialed user in any way, I could access the blood working system, and I could actually change. I say I, like our team. I wasn't the one doing this particular piece of research, but our team found that you could change the actual data in the blood working system. So for example, you could say someone is this blood type, and you could make them be administered this other blood type. And definitely one of the things you learn in the process of that kind of research is that a transfusion of the wrong blood type would actually kill somebody. That's fatal. And you didn't have to even, I don't even know if that counts as hacking. It was like accessing a system you had access to. And so you look at just the complexity of how these environments work, and everyone's focused on the wrong thing. They're all focused on privacy, and there are people focused on the patient safety thing, but it's like, oh, also patient safety. And I just have so much empathy for how difficult that challenge is.
Do you deal at all with the kind of the more recent legislation that's coming out, like with the FDA and things that are talking about like biomedical security, where they're trying to push through legislation? Have you looked into any of that? Does any of that kind of address some of the issues that you've seen?
I've been sort of having a let's wait and see attitude about the regulation, primarily because I think regulation is not a great way to drive security. It's a great way to start. It's a great way to take an industry, you think of it like seatbelts, right? Until seatbelts became required, people were dying way more. Then no one wanted to put in seatbelts, and they put in seatbelts, and now like people are surviving car crashes. And so there's an example where regulation actually did drive really positive improvements. And I do think that the types of regulations that we're seeing to better secure devices is done in that spirit for sure, and will get towards that. Problem that I have though is that it takes so long, and it requires so much compromise to get any sort of regulation passed, and it's usually done by people who do not understand the challenge. And I don't mean that, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but like, does any US senator understand a thing about cybersecurity? Like, probably not. And again, I'm not trying to be insulting. I'm just like, I don't know. And so to think that is going to be how we solve the security challenge, something that takes way longer. The attacker's already evolved and adapted by then. And it's being pushed forward by people who don't understand. It's like, that can't be our only tool.
Yeah. So is that kind of the manufacturer is kind of the one who's solely responsible, or they have to just start thinking in the terms of not just privacy, but also safety? Like, do you think that's where that's lacking?
I think the manufacturers actually do think in terms of safety. I hope I didn't convey that I thought they were not thinking that. I was thinking more like
clarifying.
because of HIPAA. HIPAA drives primarily the way like the hospitals think about where they're going to invest in security, but medical devices in health, of course, they're in a healthcare context. Medical devices are a shared responsibility, shared security model where the manufacturers, of course, they're responsible for building secure products, and the hospitals are responsible for deploying secure environments that these devices can be deployed in. And so, but both are responsible. And what kind of sometimes happens though is that everyone's like doing this thing, they're like kind of pointing at each other. And I think that's a really interesting metaphor because we're talking about like lives at stake, right? So this is a significant thing, but the same problem actually exists in pretty much every other sphere, right? Where like the big challenge that I see across industries right now, I mean, if you want to be having a conversation with someone who's building something and you want to completely change whatever the topic is, just be like, but what about securing your vendors? And everyone's like, oh, we got to talk about vendor risk management. We got to talk about third-party risk management. Like, I don't know how to deal with that. Are they insiders or are they external attackers? Like, how? It's a massive, massive problem. And it has to do with the same issue of shared responsibility models.
So Ted, your book, Hackable, tell me, who's the perfect person to read that? Like, why would someone go pick that book up and read it?
Yeah. I wrote it for people who are responsible for building secure systems. Software systems specifically, although the principles apply across the board. But so I was thinking, your typical like CTO. So the person who security is just one of their priorities. They hopefully have people working for them or within the organization who are gonna think about security too, but maybe not. And they just want it to be easier. They're like, I just want it to be secure. I want to develop these features. I want to serve our customers. I want to drive the business forward. And security kind of is getting in my way. And those types of people also, once they say, okay, now let's just do security right. Then they try to go solve their problems, whatever security challenge they might have. And the conventional approaches to how you solve those problems are usually pretty wrong. Like, for example, one of the things I talk about in the book is how you should share information with whatever security company that you hire. And a lot of people are like, no, you shouldn't share information because the attacker doesn't have that information. It's like, what? You have that information. That's an advantage. Give that to what are you doing?
Right.
And it sounded like I just had an axe to grind, but
no, I love that point.
it's a real problem. But people, the thing is people don't realize that's the wrong way to think about it. Yeah. And so that's really what who the book is for. People who are building secure systems. So CTO is sort of like the archetypal, the key persona. But I also wrote it for like security leaders who are trying to understand this area of security better. I wrote it for developers who are like, my boss is telling me to secure the thing. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And so it sort of serves those sort of three audiences: security professionals, developers, and tech leaders.
Perfect. We'll be putting a link to that in the show notes for anybody who wants to pick that up. Before I get to my last two questions, what's the best way for people to follow you? Like if they just want to know what you're doing, any new projects you're working on, just kind of maybe interact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so probably just go to tedharrington.com. Links to all my social medias on there. I'm super active on LinkedIn. If you had questions about your own security testing, you needed help, like that, there's contact forms, there's posts to our research, like everything you could possibly need, just tedharrington.com.
Perfect. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes too. Our listeners are avid readers. So besides your own book, which we'll put there, do you have a book or two that, and it doesn't need to be about the topic. It could be completely different. It can be, science fiction for all we care. But do you have a book that you read recently that you just loved that you said, man, I want people to read this?
There's several. Yeah. As you've experienced as an author, you get exposed to other authors, and that like expands your worldview into new ideas and new ways of thinking about it. And so, for example, a very, very dear friend of mine, he wrote this. He's from retail. He wrote this book called Retail Pride. It's like, I'm in cybersecurity. Why am I reading a book about retail? And as I dig into this, you realize he's talking about principles of leadership and team building and culture. And I'm like, wow, I can now apply these ideas in a new way. like I went to retail to say like, what's an idea that I can take to cybersecurity? So Retail Pride is like that's a book that I think is, and it's a really cool
and what's
book.
His name?
He's awesome. His name's Ron Thurston. He's the man.
Yeah, we're going to put that in. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And another buddy of mine, he wrote this book called The Art of Resilience. And so he's this, refugee from Iraq. He was displaced by the war, and then he, emigrates to America, and he's this like amazing human who talks about what are the principles of resilience? Like, here's a guy who like literally lived in a tent in the middle of the desert in a refugee camp and is one of the most positive people you could know, right? And how do we take, maybe not all of us have that same experience. And then certainly from a security standpoint, I'm like, well, resilience is an important part of what we do so what are those things? And I highly, highly recommend that book too. So, those are the kind of books that I'm really interested in, ones that, as much as I like security books and I like tech books, I like the ones that are going to come from other fields and make me think differently about my field.
I love that too. Those are two great ones I haven't read, so thank you for those recommendations. Who wrote The Art of Resilience?
Hussein Al-Bayadi.
Hussein Al-Bayadi. Okay, we're going to make sure we get those into the show notes. Also, links right to them. They sound like fascinating books. And funnily enough, Ryan and I were just talking about culture change and things like that. So when you started talking about Retail Pride, I also was like, what? But then when you said what it was about, I'm like, we might have to pick that one up,
Yeah.
give a little read to that. So your origin story is quite fascinating. I'm sure you had a few mentors along the way. Who would you say is your biggest mentor that helped you get to where you are today?
My biggest mentor. I've definitely been fortunate to have a number of them. I don't even know like when it was in my life, and maybe you guys have figured this out, but like, how is it that someone who seeks mentorship, like at what point you're like, I need mentors? Like somewhere in our life, we're like, a mentor is going to help me. So I feel like each step of the way on my career, I've had really, really meaningful mentors. And so it's hard to say who's the number, like the top one or whatever, but the one who's probably most directly impacted this phase of my career is my business partner. And it's really, really cool to feel like he's a dear friend of mine now. Like we're partners in business, we're friends, but I learn so much from him every day, even though we're like pretty much the same age, like we're doing the same company. Yeah. He forces me to think about the world differently. And we just did a pretty funny, an internal, like we do these internal talks at our company where it's like someone gets up and shares an idea or whatever. And so we did one together where we're like, people look at me and they look at him and they're like, you guys are two different people. Like, how did the two of you become partners? And so we just like told all the stories from the early days of the company. And it was fun to reminisce in that way, because I realized like how much I've grown because of being able to be in such close proximity to someone that smart.
That's cool. What's his name?
Steve Bono.
Steve Bono. Oh, that's awesome. It's always nice to have, we always ask that question just because for us, for Ryan and I and everyone else we've had on this podcast, there's always at least a couple people that you can name quickly that were like, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. You're like like you said, there was a moment in time where you go, I'm not going to go further than this line if I don't get someone to help drag me across it. Totally. And every stage is different, right? I mean, you said he's the same age. Ryan's younger than me, and I learn something from him every day. So it's like it's not about my mentors that I've had. Now, some of them are much older than me, but in the past, many of them were the same age or even a little younger than I was, and they still helped me get right past that line. So I've always appreciated that. Yeah.
It's interesting too to think about mentorship, because I think a lot of people, especially earlier in their career, they just assume your mentor will be somebody in your organization. Maybe it's your boss, maybe it's but it's someone who's like a little older than you or whatever, but in your company. And then people who are in small companies or people who are at the top of their company, what about them? Like that's a challenge. Where do I find, there's not like someone layers and layers and layers ahead of me that I can be like, in 15 years, I'll be like you. Yeah. And so I think mentorship is something you have to actively go find. And one thing I love about the security community is that people want to help each other. And so anyone listening, if you're like, I'm looking for a mentor, I don't have one, go find the person that you think is going to help you and hit them up on LinkedIn or something. And I bet 50% of the time they'll say yes.
I find that a fascinating message to end with, because I've had that happen to me a few times where people have just randomly reached out, and of course, I'd love to help you. right? And they always were like, I know you're probably going to say no to this, but it's like, well, hang on, well, what are you asking for, right? You want to have some conversations and talk about things you can do to improve. I'm be happy to help you with that, right? So it's wonderful, and it always feels good because that's what happened to me. I've had so many people do that and still do it for me. I still have a couple people that I consider very close mentors that help me along the way, and they give me endless amounts of time out of their busy schedule to help me with that.
That's such a good thing for you to share because, Chris, you're a luminary, right? Like people are probably super intimidated to reach out to you. So here's a story where here's this guy that's super intimidating and is happy that someone reached out and said, hey, can I ask you some questions? So hopefully people walk away from that feeling like, yeah, let me shoot my shot. Let me get help where I need it.
Do it. And I always tell people, if I don't have the time, I'll be honest with you and I'll try to help you find somebody. Right. So, I mean, that's what I always try to do. I mean, because I look at that and say, man, I've had so many people that have reached their hand out to help me when I thought, man, I'm just going to do what you said. I'm going to shoot my shot, but I know they're going to say no. And they would say yes. And then amazingly got this help. And that's why I'm here. So I love that message. It's wonderful. Man, thank you, Ted, so much for coming on today. Really fascinating conversation. Your book sounds like it's going to help so many people that are stuck. Really like something that we kind of needed in this industry, that we all like to focus on the hardcore security stuff, but it's that message of getting into the next step and how to help those people, go past that line. That really sounds like what's going to be helpful for that. So thank you so much for all of that.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I feel like I could talk to you guys all day. This is fun.
Yeah. So we could too. I mean, this is one of our longer ones because you kept saying fascinating things. So it's like, really. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And for everyone else who's joined us, thank you for listening to this podcast, and join us next month on this same series where we're going to be joined by Shane McCombs from the Innocent Lives Foundation. He's a COO over there. We'll be talking about security and how it works in that industry too. So again, check out all the show notes and you'll see everything from Ted there and links to the books that he mentioned. And we will see you next month.